Welcome back to this week's Parent Parsha series, Parashat Tetzaveh, and up and coming this week, Purim. Also this week is National Eating Disorder Awareness Week. The theme this year for National Eating Disorder Awareness Week is everyone has a seat at the table. So often when people think of eating disorders, they recognize anorexia, they think of bulimia. Hopefully they also are able to identify binge eating disorder as an eating disorder and everything that's on the spectrum in between. But it's an opportunity for us to remember that eating disorders come in all shapes, in all sizes, in all ages, in all genders, in all socioeconomic status, in all races, and it knows no bounds. And it's such an important concept. And that was, I believe, part of what the National Eating Disorder Association was trying to create an awareness around for this year's theme of everyone has a seat at the table. But one of the things that it got me thinking about, particularly in the formulation of this series, is parenting all different types of children as it relates to eating. And one of the things that I think is such a challenge is that we are naturally or hopefully training ourselves to recognize that each child needs something else. When we have a parenting style, sometimes that works for one kid, but it may not necessarily work for another child. And even within that, sometimes we relate to children in very different ways. Some children we really get and make sense to us, and other children maybe are farther from what we recognize or what we understand. Some children we might have more patience for. And I think it's such an important part of the discussion that different children we relate to differently. And in that way, for good and for bad, we parent them differently. And we try to be aware of the ways in which we parent them, again, for good and for bad. One of the things that's so important about eating, though, and how we parent around food is that based on oftentimes our own biases, there might be a tendency to parent differently around food. And one of the critical components around food in terms of healthy identity, healthy eating, healthy body image, healthy self-esteem around themselves is the ability to feel that everyone has a seat at the table. Everybody deserves to come to the table hungry and deserves to be satiated. So often I hear so painfully people who say, I don't deserve to eat, or I'm embarrassed to eat, or I feel shamed of coming to the table and making this food choice or that food choice. And what that actually ends up resulting in is that oftentimes people don't eat, they feel embarrassed to eat. And what that actually then causes is people eating in secret the foods that they actually wanted to eat, that they should have felt like they could come to the table and engage and have with everybody else. And so one of the important components that we want to think about is creating a table in which everybody feels that they can come to the table, they can make food choices, and that just because they may like certain foods more than another, or they may look certain ways different than another kid in their family, that that doesn't make them more or less worthy to come to the table hungry and leave the table feeling full and satiated. And we as parents also have an obligation to think about the ways in which we communicate that, both verbally and non-verbally, to our children. So my second point is reminding all of us that the messages we give off at a table are so critical. And when I say table, I mean the proverbial table. It might be your kitchen counter, it might be a table, it might be just interactions that are happening around food. But I think one of the most critical things that we know from a research perspective is that more often than not, children interpret our behaviors and actions and our facial expressions much more than the words coming out of our mouth. And it's something that is, on the one hand, so hard because it puts so much pressure on parents to check every aspect of themselves, which they can't do all the time. But it also means that we do have to become more mindful of the messages we're sending when it comes to food and when it comes to our kids, and recognizing that they pick up so clearly. If you say to one kid, oh yeah, grab that cookie, no big deal. But you say to another kid, oh, do you really need it? Right? That's something that, like, you're thinking to yourself, you're just inquiring. But what they hear is, well, you didn't say that to the other kid. So how come you're saying it to me? And it might be totally benign, but it also might not be benign. And kids are extraordinarily sensitive. And those are the memories that they hold deep in their brain that send them those messages of shame and embarrassment about their food choices. And we're thinking about the fact that everyone deserves to have a seat at the table, which then lands me to my third point. So we're on point number 3, which is that when we're all sitting around the table, and it follows on the modeling, which is not only are our kids mindful of the messages we're sending to them, but really being mindful of when we're sitting at a table. And that has nothing to do with parenting and nothing to do with kids, but are we narrating and making comments about the food we're eating? Or I'm not eating that right now, or I shouldn't have that, or I'm going to skip that, but I want something else later. Nobody needs to hear your own inner dialogue around food. It's so important that everybody feels like they can make their own food choices at a table, and it's everything is available for everybody, and there's no judgment, and really trying to be mindful about the fact that everyone has a seat at the table, everyone wants to be at the table, and we want to create a warm environment that's about coming together around the food, but not about the food. And that's such a critical piece, coming together around the food, but not about the food. And so 3 points. 1 point is remembering that everybody deserves to come to the table hungry and deserves to leave the table full. We never want to create an environment of shame or embarrassment. The second point is that our attitudes, our expressions, our subtle messages have such a huge impact on the people around us. Most importantly, our children, they interpret them, they internalize them. And we want to be so mindful because, on the one hand, they have the capacity to do amazing things with those messages, but they also have the capacity to do pain and harm. And so we won't be perfect because we're not, and we go for a good enough parenting model, but it's such a critical component that we want to catch ourselves in the messages we're sending. And the third piece is, whether this is about kids, whether this is about adults, whoever you're sitting around the table with, make it a table that is coming together, and we all happen to be eating because eating is a festive bonding experience, but it's not about the food. And so we're not interjecting our own emotional experiences, ambivalence around the food at the Shabbos table. When I was thinking about this idea of coming around a table and the fact that there are so many unspoken messages and so many things that are transpiring that have nothing to do with words, that are all in a facial expression, a hesitation, a natural inclination maybe to give one thing to one person and one thing to another person, it really got me thinking a little bit about this week's parasha in particular, and more like broadly, I think a little bit about the Mishkan, which is what we're in the middle of discussing. Now we've moved into the clothing of the Kohanim, and one of the pieces, one of the psukim, talks about the fact that we identify the building of the Mishkan and the building and the creation of the clothes of the Kohanim with Chachmei Lev. And the Emek Davar points out like this wisdom of heart, that we don't usually associate wisdom in our heart. We associate wisdom in our brain. So what is the message that's trying to be communicated here? That wisdom is, yes, it's in the brain. It's oral. It has words associated to it. It's a thoughtfulness. It's a intellectual capacity and component, but it's also an emotional experience. It's the fear of God. It's our relationship with God. And each thing is intertwined with the other. Rav Amital, in one of his Divrei Torah about this week's Parsha, points out the fact that the Mishkan and the Kohanim are about balancing these two components. It's about imbuing and creating an environment of Torah learning, but it's also about creating an environment in the Beit HaMikdash of Yirat Hashem and a spirituality and an emotional connection. And one of the ways that that occurs is actually thinking about the fact that in the Mishkan, there are things that are very visual and things that are very musical and sound-oriented. It's not so much word-based. There's a lot of actions that are happening. We think about the fact that the pomegranates on the bottom of the Kohen are specific because we're supposed to be able to hear them on the bottom of the Kohen's clothing. We think about the song and the music that was a critical component of the Mishkan. And it really got me thinking about this very powerful podcast that I heard today. Earlier this week by somebody named Rabbi Dr. Ariel Berger. He is a student of Elie Wiesel, and he wrote a book called Witness. And he was interviewed in this podcast, and he talked about the fact he comes from a Hasidic background. He was talking about the fact that when he has a very strong memory of early learning early learning of Torah and Tanakh, of Bible, and he notes so beautifully that in every daf, in every formulation of a page, whether it's a page of Gemara, the oral Torah, whether it's a page of Torah, the Bible, there's always empty white space on the side. And that empty white space on the side is our emotional engagement, right? It's not just that we are learning the text, but it's that we've taken it in and we have space on the outside to write down our notes, to write the things that we thought about, we connected to, it hit a chord inside of us. We're thinking about it in relation to something else. Maybe it inspired us to ask a question. And so we see a fusing of the raw knowledge and the ability to learn that's in the brain and the inspiration that comes from the heart. And there's a place for it. And then he goes on, it was an amazing podcast. And for anybody who wants it, I will happily share where I heard it. He talked a lot about song. He talked a lot about the fact that in the absence of words, in the absence of being able to articulate something, sometimes all we have is song. Um, and he articulates in his book, it says, how could you sing? And then he says, but how could you not sing? That song is the absence of words, and it's so powerful and it's so connecting, and it brings us together and it lifts us up. And I'm thinking about it from the perspective that that is what our role is, what our job is. We're trying to not only use our words to communicate and send messages and to learn, whether it's when we're teaching ourselves information, when we're teaching our children, when we're sharing information, but thinking about the fact that there's also so much that happens that's unspoken. And it really just got me thinking. And he talked a little bit about, he shared a really beautiful story that on the one hand, I think almost has no place here, but I feel compelled to share it. And hopefully I'll be able to tie it in a tiny bit. One of the things that he points out is that Elie Wiesel, on the one hand, was a man of deep faith and at the same time really struggled in his relationship with Hashem, which is so understandable given the depths of the horror that he went through. And he inspired to write this song about Ani Mami, a song lost and found again, that he's struggling in his faith. And I think it's so fascinating that it was through song that he wrote it, that even though he's struggling, he's using and articulating music and song and trying to bring in all the various people, all the various things and experiences that he had. So there's this one story that Dr. Berger relates at the end of this podcast. He says that when his son was on a tour, I guess it was not a tour, it was a trip to Poland. And he made a friend. And one day the friend disappeared and went with a counselor, and they just kind of went off together. And people were like, where are they going? And when he got back, the friend said to him, I'll tell you where I went. My grandparents were both Holocaust survivors. They married 3 weeks before they were deported to Auschwitz. And each day during the Holocaust, when they were in Auschwitz, they would go up to they would meet each other by the place where the women's camp and the men's camp were divided, and they would check in on each other and try to share whatever extra food the other one had. And at some point, his grandmother got deported to a satellite camp, and the satellite camp was actually a rabbit farm, and they were doing experiments on the rabbits for typhus. And the foreman on the rabbit farm noticed that the prisoners were being treated so horribly. They were feeding the rabbits better than they were feeding the Jews, and he was able to kind of sneak food and in that way really keep all these people who were working in his camp alive. And at some point, his grandmother got a cut on her arm, and she developed an infection. She cut on the barbed wire, she got an infection, and the foreman recognized and knew that all she needed was antibiotics. But he also knew she would not be able to get it because they didn't care. So he cut his arm and he put his arm up against hers, and he thereby contracted the infection. And he went to the Nazis and he said, I'm one of your best foremen. I don't think you want to lose me. And they said, you're right, we don't. He said, well, I have an infection. I need antibiotics. So he got the antibiotics, and he then gave that antibiotics to this woman's grandmother, and she lived and survived the war. He said, I went to go back and actually go and visit my grandmother, survive, like the woman who helped my grandmother survive and live on, because I owe my life to that person. I was thinking about it in such like a powerful way, and I almost had a moment where I was imagining what that meeting must have been like, right? He didn't speak Polish, and I'm sure the other person maybe didn't speak English, but it was a meeting that was probably so powerful, and there was probably no words. But I imagine in the space of words, there was probably song. I'm thinking about the fact that there are so many things that are hard to communicate, and we really are going to utilize song to carry us through. as we look towards the next couple of months with hope and anticipation of what, please God, should come, that we enter in the month of Adar, Marbim B'Simcha, and that takes us into Pesach, a month of Geula, and we should have a Geula, the Geula that was then, we should, please God, have a Geula for now. And as we're coming up on a year really of when the pandemic started, I think for people, they feel a sense of, on the one hand, hopelessness, and on the one hand, hopefulness. And I think it's our job to tap into all the different faculties that we have, and to be a source of inspiration and a source of belief that the Geula is on its way. And please God, we will all be able to sit together around tables and make our tables about the people that we're with, and share song and share wonderful words of inspiration and Torah with each other in the upcoming months. Now on to our treats. So I think you have a couple of options, and I think that anything and everything works. So it's Purim, and it's Seudah Purim. So I only put on here baked goods, but I do think that it's an opportunity to just remind everybody, I like baking. Baking works in my house, but it may not work in your house. And so one of the things I'm really encouraging people to do is to take some of the inspiration, if it works for you, and try to apply it in your house. So if your kids are home and they like coloring, or you're more of an artistic person and you want to decorate your home or decorate your table for Seudat Purim, or to go into Shabbat as festive for Seudat Purim. So maybe you want to just print out some mask pages, have you or your kids or whoever decorate them and cut them out and put them around the table. Maybe you want to make some fun groggers. Maybe you want to find other creative ways that are using different skills to make it a festive experience. These were some cookies that I made a few years ago. They're fun, they're easy because they roll out their shape and you just throw sprinkles on them. I love baking for Purim, but again, part of the dynamic is that there's a lot of baking going on right now for some people in some homes, and so maybe making interesting things for Shabbat is off the table because all your energies are put into the Purim Seudah, which is also amazing and excellent, because whatever we can do in our bandwidth that brings us to the table as happy, healthy individuals is the most important thing, and what everybody around us will remember. So I actually decided to make these chocolate olive oil crinkle cookies from Millennial Kosher, busy in Brooklyn, because it has olive oil, and there's a lot of olive oil discussed in this week's Parsha in terms of the mishcha, the anointing. Last year at the beginning of pandemic, you'll notice on the bottom corner, it was also this week's Parsha, and we did, each of the kids got to decorate their own big day kahuna, their own kohen with the different clothing. I also decided to do a pomegranate cake and any other pomegranate related treats, or even just putting pomegranates in your salads might be the way to go in terms of the pomegranates that were at the bottom of the kohen's clothing. This was amazing. This person decorated a whole kohen on what looks like a Duncan Hines brownie cake. So again, use your kids, use yourself, know your bandwidth. And I'm always interested in hearing what other people do that's not necessarily baking related. And I just want to encourage everybody to use whatever skills you have in whatever time you have and whatever bandwidth you have to make it a festive Shabbat, a festive Chag, a festive holiday. And I want to wish everybody a happy Purim. I grew up in a Sephardi home, so we say Buen Purim, Purim Sameach, Freilich and Purim, whatever language is of your choice. It should be Marbim B'Simcha, and we should enter the month of Adar with the Geula B'Mehera V'Yameinu to come our way very soon. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and a happy Purim.